science shows the opposite. So when my colleague says that the government is dividing people and doesn't know what it's doing, I'd like him to explain to me how the posture of his own party differs.
Good question. Thank the honourable member for her question. And in fact, she's correct in mentioning the whole issue of divisiveness. This government revels on the whole notion of issue and wedge issues to create division, to turn Canadians against one another. I don't know about the members opposite, but I think we are all here because we want to help people, not because we want to turn the majority against the minority. Our job as government is, and as representatives, is to work together to find solutions that bridge those differences, to find accommodations for those that don't want to be vaccinated. We shouldn't be seeing what we're seeing out on the streets of Ottawa. This government has brought it about. It's the manifestation of their own wedge issue politics, and they should be ashamed of that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Courtenay Alberni.
I'm just going to read a quote here from February 13th, 2020, from the member from Carleton. He said, this is in terms of Indigenous land defenders protesting. He says, these blockades are taking away the freedom of other people to move their goods in themselves. That is wrong, and the government has laws and tools in place to combat it. But right now, Madam Speaker, we're seeing an occupation of a Canadian city, and the member from Carleton and the Conservative caucus primarily is standing with the occupiers, where we're seeing horrible acts, Madam Speaker. Now, if this is the way protests are going to take place, and the Conservatives want to govern this country, how do they expect to govern this country if they're supporting occupations and protests in a new way like this, Madam Speaker? Maybe the member can explain.
A brief answer from the member for Niagara Falls.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I'd like to comment on the member's question, again, by repeating. What we see out on the streets in Ottawa today is a manifestation of their divisive nature of politics. They are reaping what they have created by running on wedge issues. They are turning Canadians against each other. We all believe in the right of peaceful protest. Where was this government this weekend? The Prime Minister decided to take a personal day off instead of working to resolve this issue. Canadians deserve better. We need to get back to work, and we need to be working for Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'm rising to speak on Bill C8 with some sadness. Yes, there's some minor provisions in there that we support. But what this really represents, Madam Speaker, is a real disconnect between this Liberal government and what is actually happening across this country. The fallout from COVID has been enormous, but not just of COVID, but a series of policies put into place by the former Harper government, by the current government, that all lead to the same thing: massive levels of inequality, more and more poverty and misery, more difficulties for Canadians. Now, Madam Speaker, Bill C8 doesn't mention this, but it should. The appalling withdrawal of CRB benefits, just a few hours' notice, it took place a few months ago. 800,000 Canadian families were depending on those benefits to actually put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head. And this government crudely, irresponsibly ripped that safety net away from nearly 1 million Canadian families with just a scant few hours' notice. Unbelievable, Madam Speaker, that any government would act this way, but this government just doesn't seem to understand the impacts of their many policies that promote inequality and what that has done to Canadians over the last few years. Madam Speaker, as I've mentioned in the House before, my wife, Lee May, and I grow vegetables for the local food banks in Burnaby and New Westminster, out in Barnston Island. It's a farming district, very fertile land, and we basically use space that's rented by Chuck Buckmeyer, a local municipal councillor, about 40 hectares of land, and we're able to grow squash and tomatoes and a wide variety of vegetables. So we then contribute to the food banks. Now, Speaker, we've been doing this for many years, and for many years there's been, tragically, a maintaining of the long food bank lineups that we have seen. Canadians of all backgrounds, seniors, people with disabilities, students, having to go to a food bank to make ends meet. In the last 2 years, Madam Speaker, we have seen a sharp increase in the number of Canadians, the number of British Columbians, the number of people in New Westminster and Burnaby that have had to go to food banks to make ends meet. We've seen in sharp relief how that massive level of inequality that we're seeing in this country and the devastation left by COVID has created more and more difficulties for Canadians. And so, Madam Speaker, what we need to recommit to, I believe, in the House of Commons is actually responding to what Canadians are feeling across the length and breadth of this country. And food bank lineups are growing. When the number of homeless are growing, there should be a compelling argument, Madam Speaker, that the government actually acts to respond to those needs. And the government has an ability to act. We saw that at the beginning of COVID. On March 13th, 2020, when the House leaders, and I was one of them, marched out into that corridor, Madam Speaker, and we announced that we would be suspending Parliament because of the incredible increase of cases across the country in this pandemic. We believed at that time, and we called at that time, for the government to take immediate action to help Canadians. And they acted promptly. Within 96 hours, 4 days, Madam Speaker, they took their initiative themselves, and not with the support of the NDP, but took the initiative to immediately prop up Canada's big banks and their profits. $750 billion in liquidity supports. I'll say that figure again, Madam Speaker, because it's so incredibly large. It's unbelievable. But $750 billion was made available to the banking sector to make sure that their profits were maintained on no conditions. They didn't have to do anything for that massive amount of liquidity supports, including from CMHC, Canadian Housing, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that is supposed to be providing supports for Canadians to get housing. No conditions at all. It was just thrown at the banking sector so that they could maintain their profits. 4 days, Madam Speaker. And so the NDP got to work because the government really didn't seem to have any direction at all. And the leader of the NDP from Burnaby South and the entire NDP caucus leveraged our position here in this minority parliament to force a CERB at $2,000 a week, to put in place a student CERB, to put in place supports for seniors and for people with disabilities, to make sure that we were pushing for paid sick leave for Canadians. This was absolutely fundamentally important, Madam Speaker. So the government's reaction, the government's priority was to prop up banking profits. And fortunately, because it was a minority parliament, we were able to force them to actually start thinking about people. $750 billion in liquidity supports for Canada's big banks, and a reluctance to do things for real people, except when in a minority parliament they are forced to do so, Madam Speaker. And this is something that I think is clear to Canadians when they look at this government and what it has done since the increase in inequality and the massive propping up of the banking sector that we saw under the former Harper government. Madam Speaker, the Harper government was criticized for $116 billion in bank supports. We're now at $750 billion. The Harper government was criticized quite justifiably for the massive tax loopholes that we've seen with overseas tax havens. And in fact, Conservatives and Liberals agree on that. They just, there's no limit to when it comes to making sure that the ultra-rich can take their money offshore. Both parties have participated in this feeding frenzy to give as much as they can to the ultra-rich. And now, Madam Speaker, as you well know, we're now looking at $25 billion a year, each and every year. $50 billion since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. $250 billion over the course of the last decade under Conservatives and Liberals that the ultra-rich were able to take offshore. Can you imagine, just for a moment, Madam Speaker, if we were looking at a Bill C-8 that actually responded to Canadians' needs? if we actually stopped those massive tax loopholes for the ultra-rich and reinvested that money in housing, in supports for seniors, in supports for post-secondary education, in expanding our healthcare sector, Madam Speaker, as you well know, with Tommy Douglas, when he forced a government of the day to actually put in place universal Medicare, was always with the idea to move from there to public universal pharmacare, to put in place dental care, to make sure, as the member from Burnaby South says so eloquently, that we had health care from the top of our heads to the soles of our feet. And you can imagine if we just stopped for a moment that hemorrhaging of $25 billion a year to offshore tax havens, the kind of investments we could make in public universal pharmacare and dental care, actually make a difference in people's lives. Canadians that are struggling with record levels of inequality. And the inequality is getting worse, Madam Speaker. The top 1% of Canadians now have a quarter of the pie. Nearly 50% of Canadians, and that includes Indigenous peoples, that includes marginalized Canadians across this country. 50% of Canadians are within $200 of insolvency in the course of any month, and they have no share of the pie at all. Well, look at that picture, Madam Speaker. What these policies have created, and we see this in C8, where there are minor things done that we support, but that don't tackle the fundamental issues that we're seeing in inequality in this country. Just imagine a C8 that actually started to reinvest in Canadians, started to reinvest in the right to housing, started to reinvest in public universal pharmacare, made the investments that are so important so that Canadians can actually see their standard of living improve. And we would no longer have a country where half of Canadians are excluded from any share of prosperity or any share of the economic pie. And 1% of Canadians, the ultra-rich, not only have access to a tax system that allows them to